This is a presentation on the French diet and cuisine in the 1700s. To start off, we'll talk about the nutrition. The average supply of calories was between 16 and 1800 calories. In comparison, in France today, the average caloric intake is 3500 calories. However, the 16 to 1800 calorie average isn't so bad when you compare it to China in the 1940s to 60s, where they have about the same caloric intake. In general, back then, the French consumed less calories because there was less available food, since you were stuck with the food supplies in your area. Also, people didn't eat as well back then, particularly the poor, who would usually survive only on bread and cereals. And now, onto the cuisine. At the time, the French culture was the most prominent in the world, and thus the cuisine was also considered the best in the world. This was a result of a couple of factors. One of the main driving forces of this was Louis XIV's lavish lifestyle in Versailles. One of the main parts of the lifestyle was eating an enormous amount of food to the point where you're only eating for pleasure, essentially gluttony. Created a demand for luxurious meals called high cuisine. To satisfy this demand, Francis Pierre La Varenne created a cookbook dedicated to these meals, which was considered the first French cookbook. Cookbook Le Cuisinier François used sauces to make meats taste better, such as bechamel, which was a sauce of butter, flour, and milk. This made French cuisine a lot better than what was compared to the world, because instead of just eating the nasty meat, they added sauces to it, which made it taste a little better. However, the consumption of meat was largely solely by the aristocratic noble class. Aside from meat, nobles would eat coffee, tea, chocolates, and the king was infamous for having his large meal at supper that consisted of a whole pheasant, with a side of vegetables, a large dish of salad, 2 slices of ham, mutton with garlic, a plate of cakes, and eggs prepared in various ways, and 4 different types of soup. This shows that even though the average caloric intake was lower at the time, the nobles ate a lot, maybe even more than some people today. Obviously, this would later become a problem when French peasants were starving and could barely have food to eat, when nobles were still fat and eating cakes at Versailles. However, of course, peasants ate quite differently from the nobles. First of all, they rarely ate meat. Their diet centered around bread and cereals. This resulted in a quite unhealthy diet, and explains why, despite the nobles eating so much, the average caloric intake at the time was around half the modern day. The bread and grains used back then for food for the peasants isn't as refined as it is today. Wasn't as refined as it is today. Peasants were usually forced to eat whole grains and whole bread with pieces of cereal in between, which probably didn't taste as good, and thus the bread they're eating probably isn't as good as the baguette you say you can get from Panera. Also, unfortunately, there were no croissants at the time, so yeah. Aside from the cereals and bread, the peasant diet also largely centered around legumes, which are similar to peas in the way they're displayed here, and they were used to suck up the sauces and meat juices from the leftover plates of nobles, and allowed for the peasants to experience some taste in their food akin to what the nobles were able to taste. However, as time went on, people from the lower class started getting wealthier and wealthier, almost to the point of having more wealth than the people of the upper estates, and thus the cultures of the two started to mix, and the lower classes, or people of the lower citizens were able to experience the food the nobles had.